The Italians are on the run.
Right, that's right.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
At the end of January 1941, Florey was ready to begin human trials. The first possibility was a volunteer from within the Dunn School staff. The objection to this path was the risk of subjecting an otherwise perfectly healthy young man or woman to a potentially fatal dose of an untried substance. A dose 3,000 times as large as the mice received might have unforeseen side effects. Florey gargled with the raw penicillin broth to try to cure a sore throat. It didn't work, and it made no sense for the man leading the team to risk the whole project by experimenting on himself. He had to turn elsewhere. The nearby Radcliffe Infirmary and County Hospital, like all hospitals at this time, had wards full of patients with bacterial infections. The man given the job of finding the first patient was Dr. Charles Fletcher, a Radcliffe intern.
The first thing I was asked to do was to find someone who was dying, inevitably dying, of some disease, in whom it wouldn't really matter if the first injection proved fatal.
Fletcher chose 43-year-old County Police Constable number 231, Albert Alexander. Constable Alexander had been injured during a German bombing raid on Birmingham. Bacterial infection was running riot through his body. A series of blood transfusions had failed. His life expectancy was 48 hours. The amount of penicillin needed for a cure was completely unknown. There was a real risk they would run out, but they had a solution to that problem. They knew penicillin could be extracted from urine after it passed through the body. So they set up a bicycle relay to take Alexander's urine back to the Dunn School. Someone christened it the Pea Patrol. With just a few ounces of the powder, they began the treatment. It was all so new, the nurse misspelt the name.
February 12th, 1941. Penicillin administration begun. 200 milligrams intravenous injection.
Alexander's temperature dropped from 103 degrees to normal in 12 hours. The bacterial infection was halted. But how much penicillin would they need to kill off the infection completely?
February 13th. Much less discharge from the scalp and orbits. Right eye vision clear. Penicillin continued. Seems very cheerful in himself. Says he is getting better. February. Patient very much better.
Every few hours, someone was on duty to make the ride. Ethel was now practicing at the Radcliffe and took her turn. By the end of the third day, the dose was entirely dependent on the penicillin extracted from his urine. But each time, a little of the precious liquid was lost. It was like trying to fill a bath with the plug out. Florey's notes record a grim last entry.
March 15th, becoming steadily weaker. Died this morning. The attempt to treat this forlorn case was chiefly valuable in that it showed penicillin can be given over a period of 5 days without toxic effect. We will not go into any other case unless we are sure that we have enough penicillin. Until we are sure, we shall treat only children.
A child would need less penicillin, and by the time Heatley's machine had produced enough for another trial, a child was available. 14-year-old Johnny Cox was admitted to the Radcliffe with a blood clot behind his left eye brought on by a staphylococcus infection in his eye socket. Johnny Cox was dying, but they believed they had enough penicillin for his small body. Again, the effect was immediate. There was talk in the hospital of an amazing success, even a miracle. On Monday the 22nd, his body was almost completely clear of infection. Penicillin was stopped. In the early hours of the morning, Johnny Cox suddenly vomited and went into convulsions. His temperature soared. 4 days later, he was dead. Had the penicillin killed him? Florey convinced the parents to allow an autopsy. It confirmed that the penicillin had conquered the bacteria in every corner of his small body, but it could not repair the damage already done to a vital artery. With his new surge of life, the artery had burst. Penicillin was in the clear. They treated 5 other patients at the Radcliffe, but the deaths of Alexander and Johnny Cox prevented the clinical trials being the unqualified triumph Florey wanted. The fungus factory and Heatley's machine had reached their limit. They couldn't make enough. The manufacture of penicillin had to be taken over by bigger players. Florey sought the advice of Sir Edward Mellanby. Together they agreed that Florey and Heatley would make the dangerous flight to America. Chain, who believed he should have gone to America in Heatley's place, remained in Oxford in charge of the lab. For Chain, it was yet another unforgivable betrayal. On the morning of June the 27th, 1941, they boarded a Dutch plane bound for Lisbon en route to the USA. Florey carried with him samples of the mould. He also had a proof of their new Lancet article on the clinical trials on humans. Florey and Heatley spent 4 months crisscrossing the country, meeting pharmaceutical companies and key government officials. The visit gave Florey an opportunity to see his children.
They are both well, although Charles is recovering from a bout of chicken pox. He was bouncing around cheerfully today. Lucia has done a marvellous job. Park seemed to be enjoying herself in camp, and I gather...
Despite their marital difficulties, Howard had encouraged Ethel to work with him on further penicillin trials. While he was away, she was using what penicillin was available to test its effect on burns. After 4 months of knocking on doors, Florey returned to Oxford. He had sown the seeds of the antibiotic revolution. His work would pay off in the coming year. They decided that Heatley would stay to pass on the secrets of the Oxford work to American scientists.
This is an emergency communique from the port.
Then, on December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. America was in the war, and suddenly pharmaceutical companies began to take the new drug seriously. Norman Heatley went to work with the drug company Merck, And while he was there, something happened which thrust penicillin further into the limelight.
Very good. How's Mrs. Miller?
Anne Miller was a 30-year-old mother of 3 children. After nursing her youngest boy for a throat infection, she became ill herself. Weeks later, she was dying. By chance, Anne Miller's doctor had heard about the Oxford work and thought it might offer one last hope.
I had on hand 5.5 grams, a teaspoon, half the amount of penicillin in the entire United States.
It was soluble in water. That's all that they had been told from where it had come, and that I was to have it very frequently. So every 4 hours, I would be given into my vein, and in a matter of 12 hours, I can honestly say the nurse looked at me, and my temperature apparently was changing, and I had a very distinct smell of mustard. It was strong. I smelled English mustard.
Mrs. Miller's physician was a very nice, modest man, Dr. Bumstead. Every day while she was receiving her penicillin, he used to ring me up in the morning and say yesterday's culture had 3 colonies, her temperature was so-and-so. What do you suggest? Should we continue with the penicillin? Every time this happened, many times, I would say, look, I'm not medically qualified. It would be quite unethical for me to suggest anything. Then he would say, well, what would the professor say? And I would say, well, he would say, carry on. You know, you can't stop it now.
4 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, the telephone rang, and anyone who knew Jack Bumstead would know that he had a very soft voice. And there was a pause when I picked up the telephone and said, yes, Jack. And nothing was said for a minute or so. And he said, you can take a half a breath, but keep your fingers crossed. Anne's temperature is normal.
Anne Miller's temperature chart from that night is preserved in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. It shows her temperature dropping from 105 degrees at 3 p.m. to normal at 9 a.m. the following morning. If the argument for large-scale production of penicillin needed a push, the miraculous cure of Anne Miller fitted the bill perfectly. His work done, Heatley returned to Oxford in July 1942. 2 weeks later, the telephone rang. Alexander Fleming had called to ask a favour. He wanted penicillin to treat a personal friend who was dying in St Mary's Hospital in London. Florey agreed to give Fleming all the penicillin they had on hand. It was an act of unguarded generosity towards a man he had seen only twice in 12 years, one he would regret. On the 31st of August 1941, a story appeared in the Times about a miraculous new drug called penicillin. The next day, a letter appeared in the Times from Fleming's boss at St Mary's Hospital, Sir Almroth Wright.
Sir, in the leading article on penicillin in your issue yesterday, you refrained from putting the laurel wreath for this discovery around anyone's brow. It should be decreed to Professor Alexander Fleming of this laboratory, for he is the discoverer of penicillin, and was the author of the original suggestion that this substance might...
It began a flood of publicity focused on St Mary's and Fleming.
In a miracle operation at St Mary's Hospital in London, a new drug being hailed as the magic bullet against infection inside the body was administered by its discoverer, Dr. Alexander Fleming. Dr. Fleming and the hospital are claiming a world first. The patient was given up for dead until the miracle drug was administered by
The Oxford team was outraged. The St Mary's press campaign made no mention of their work. The few reporters who did come to the Dunn School were turned away. By taking this action, Florey didn't help the Oxford cause, but there was more to it than a simple dislike of publicity.
The professor told me that he feared disruptions to our work, to my schedule. But more than that, he thought it was utterly wrong to write about this drug as magic. It is not a cure-all. And it's cruel to offer hope to the dying and their families that such a substance exists, and then to tell them that they cannot have it supplied.
Where their work was mentioned, it produced a flood of desperate letters.
Dear Doctor, I've been reading about you, your work, and your new discovery, penicillin. I'm writing to you as the last chance I have of ever being well again. And I do hope for the best. Even an experiment would be better than nothing.
Not very much whether penicillin would be any help in your...
Florey asked Margaret Jennings to soften his rather abrupt style in the replies.
No, this type of
He wrote to Mellanby, seeking an official correction to what he described as the unscrupulous campaign carried on from St Mary's to credit Fleming with all the work done here, but he was told to ignore it. He was assured that the British medical establishment knew that the real work had been done at Oxford.
Here at St Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington, through this very window, a speck of mould...
A series of myths grew around Fleming and St Mary's that would be impossible to shake in the years to come. Even the story of the spores blowing in the window was later found to be untrue. In fact, the spores came up the stairway from where another scientist was working on moulds. Press Baron Lord Beaverbrook was a patron of St Mary's Hospital. He is on record as stating that it was his duty to see that the credit went to Fleming. As a result of the Oxford work and that of other British and American scientists, penicillin played an important role in the treating of casualties in the D-Day invasion. It's been estimated that it saved 300,000 lives during the last stages of the war. Penicillin production in the USA had the highest priority of any military item except the atomic bomb. Production was measured in billions of units. It was time for the Dunn School to return to being a research laboratory and a teaching institution.
I'm strenuously trying to get out of the penicillin racket, as it seems to arouse all the worst instincts in those who have anything to do with it. The spectacle of everybody who has ever had the slightest bit to do with it crowding in to prove how important their contributions to the matter are.
One of the busybodies claiming credit was Adolf Hitler. Despite the Oxford team's early fears, the Germans never had penicillin. But that was no obstacle to Hitler. He awarded the Iron Cross, first class, to his personal physician for its discovery. In early 1944, there was talk of a Nobel Prize for penicillin. A campaign began in the Beaverbrook Press for Alexander Fleming to be given the prize for medicine. Florey's friends in America, led by John Fulton, campaigned for the Oxford work to be recognized as well. As the Nobel Committee deliberated, Fleming toured America. He was taken to meet Ann Miller. Fleming proudly told reporters, "She is my most important patient."